Greetings, everyone. I hope you are well. Down below, as a reminder, if you would like merch from the Back to Ashes channel, that link can be found in the description box. As well, if you are enjoying what you're hearing, you can buy me a coffee as well. That link is in the description box. For those of you that already have purchased a coffee or merch, I appreciate you. Every little bit helps the channel and helps me out as well. With that being said, it is time for your dose of vocal melatonin. Today's featured guest, you all may know him very well. He's a dear friend of mine. I am honored to introduce Inner Scarce Sleep. Now, tuck in, get warm, and let's get ready for these true Let's Not Meet stories.
I'll start by saying I have a terrible biological father. He's been a shady person all of my life and constantly caused me a lot of grief. This is just one of those examples. When I was 4, my parents split up. My mother and I moved states, and they agreed I would visit my dad every school holiday for a week. This one particular time, I had been with him for a few days when I was playing with my cousin at a nearby park. A car pulled up, and I recognized the man as one of my dad's friends. He called me over, and without thinking, I ran over to him and left my cousin at the park. He asked me if I could show him where my dad lived, and I agreed and got in his car. I gave directions and didn't notice at all that they weren't following them correctly. Looking back, I didn't really know the way anyhow. After way too long, I did realize that we were getting closer to the city, which is far from my dad's house. We pulled up at a house I didn't recognize, and the man told me to wait in the car. I did. I didn't feel scared at all for some reason. He eventually took me inside, and I definitely started to feel unsafe then. I mainly remember 2 girls passed out with their tops off, and a much older man was feeling them up everywhere. I made eye contact with this man, and he made me sick to my stomach. I had definitely figured out that this was a bad situation by this point. A lady took me into a bedroom and brought me a sandwich. The bread was stale, and I wasn't hungry, but I ate it because I felt bad for her. Which doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what I was thinking about. The lady told me a lot of things I didn't understand, but when she left, I remember thinking my dad was coming to pick me up soon. I fell asleep waiting for him. I wet the bed that night, and no one came to see me the next day until I cried very loudly and banged on the door. The lady came back and yelled at me for stinking up her bedroom, and I asked about my dad. She said he was coming tonight after he finished work. She didn't offer me a shower or a bath, so I sat in my soiled pants all day. After that, everything turned into a blur, really. My dad did not come that night, and I was so terrified. In my head, I felt like I was there for months. I thought I was missing school, and everyone had forgotten about me. In reality, I was there for 5 days. They let me take 1 shower. I don't remember eating much except for boring sandwiches, and I had chips and gravy once. Finally, my mom drove across the country to come and get me, after not being able to get a hold of me or my dad for so long, and then me missing my pre-booked flight home. She panicked and came looking for me. Thank God she did. She found my dad at his girlfriend's house, methed out completely, hiding out. Turns out he owed a lot of drug money to the people who had taken me. They had told him that they had taken me, but he couldn't afford it, or didn't want me back. Whatever it was, he didn't bother to try and get me back. My amazing mom paid his debt for him after borrowing from a lot of people, and she came to get me back. I remember when someone came into that room and told me that my mom was there, and I walked out and I could smell her. It was the best feeling to feel safe again. She took me home, and I didn't see my dad for a long time. She never called the police. My parents' relationship was very complicated then, and I fully understand the choices that she made. I'm definitely okay now. I've spoken about this in therapy, and I've come to terms with most of the things that I went through as a child. But still, a messed up situation for a 4-year-old girl to have to be in. So, to my dad's friend, the sandwich lady, and even to my dad himself. Let's not meet.
I shared my Ring doorbell with my buddy, who asked me if I had ever watched the doorbell messages she had left for me. I have never thought about looking at who's rang my doorbell for some reason. I don't take that feature seriously, so I flipped through the recorded videos, not expecting to see anything other than my friends as they come inside. My roommate and I sometimes doing an outfit check on the freaking doorbell and evidence of how often I use DoorDash, probably. Let me just say first, I was confused as to why he wouldn't just ask me what he needed to ask me while I am in public outside and in a more normal place to approach someone rather than obviously overstep a boundary and make me question whether or not I'm safe when I walk down the street with my dogs, or if I genuinely need to be looking over my shoulder. I have no clue who this is or what he could want, but why would there be a creepy man on video on my Ring doorbell? I went back and looked at my Ring notification history just to see, right before he rings my doorbell. What came after came immediately before, and I mean within the minute. I had just finished walking one of my dogs. Once I got inside my building, which is a big house that has an unlocked front door during the day, I realized I had left the door unlocked because I didn't feel the need to. It was roughly a minute for him to come inside immediately after me. Each time, I've never seen this man before, and I had no idea anyone ever followed me inside or tried to get me to come to the door for whatever reason more than once. I literally do not know anything so far, whatever that's worth. I kind of feel like maybe I'm being stalked. Is it weird of me to think that maybe it does have something to do with my dogs? That might sound stupid, but they are a really interesting breed. I've heard of people stealing animals. I just don't know what to think of this entire situation. There really isn't much I can do besides let my landlord know, and he'll just tell me to call the police, in which case I wouldn't even know what to say. So, to the man leaving weird cryptic stuff on my Ring camera, please leave me alone. This story happened to me back when I still lived at my parents' house. I was commuting to college at the time and had 3 siblings that also lived at home, my brother and 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded on both sides by woods and farmlands. Additionally, during the week, my dad normally left for work at 2 a.m., so I had always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. However, on this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was home. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and coming out of our rooms, you could look down over the banister to see our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of the haze and realize what was going on. I looked at the clock and it was around 2:30 a.m., and my brother told me there were 2 men at our front door. Now this really woke me up. We quietly walk out of my room and peek over to look down at the front door. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I noticed my parents off to the side, out of view of the glass on the front door. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me there were 2 guys who had been talking to each other and knocking on the door. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back to my room and grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure they weren't at the door. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs, as it is in direct view of the door. My brother is right behind me as we head over to where my parents are, whispering to try and find out what is going on. My parents had awoken to the sound of our dog barking and had come out to find these two men knocking loudly at the door. At this point, the men returned and began knocking again, despite the fact that no one had come to the door and our dog was still actively barking. The fact that they were there at this time in a location where houses are spread out hundreds of yards and still knocking with a dog barking made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes, the men walked away and we all shuffle across the kitchen to the family room to peek out the windows into our driveway, which is lit up by our outside light. There was a black Cadillac sitting there, but no one was inside from what we could see. Immediately, the question was, where did these guys go? They weren't in their car, and they were no longer at the front door. Unfortunately, we figured out the answer when the handles on our back French door started jiggling. They were actively trying to enter the back of our house, which enters into the kitchen. At this point, I just remember my mom frantically saying, "David," to my dad, as pure terror overwhelmed her. Then two things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility that I might have to shoot these men. Secondly, my dad finally grabbed the phone, called the police, and calmly told them what was happening. Thankfully, after a minute of jiggling, they stopped at the back door and disappeared, only to return to their knocking at the front. However, at this point, several minutes had gone by, and suddenly we saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers with their lights on. As they whipped into our driveway and front yard, the two men bolted away, attempting to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of our view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer yelling for him to get on the ground. He didn't, and he was immediately tased and fell on the ground. Some of the officers went around the house after the other guy, and one of them came to talk to my dad and I as we came out the front. They ended up finding the other man hiding in my sister's little playhouse in the backyard. It appears both of them were drunk and or high, as the one who hid had cocaine on him. While they were both arrested that night, we never did find out what they were charged with or what happened to them. Needless to say, the whole experience wasn't fun. So, random men at our door in the middle of the night, we hope we never see you again. Now, this is something I really want to talk about to be sure that everyone is cautious and stays level-headed at all times. Now, for context, I lived in the middle of nowhere in Canada. It was an old town that had quite a few abandoned buildings due to absence of residents. Me and many friends were tired of the lack of entertainment options for us, so what we did was explore these abandoned buildings. Prior to the experience I'm about to talk about, we never had anything too crazy happen to us. Occasionally, we'd see a small bit of blood-like liquid, and we did see a pentagram on the ground from someone who went to a house previously, but nothing too bad, until the last time I had gone exploring abandoned buildings. Now, when I was younger, I used to go to a daycare that was part mental hospital. Weird combination, I know. It closed down due to a lack of patients and lack of children at the daycare. I decided to go back there with my friends a few years ago. For context, I was 15 when this happened. Most of my friends were the same age. When we did get there, it was rather cliche. There was fog, it was rather dark, and there was a little light drizzle of rain. We went to the main gate, which was padlocked shut. We decided to help each other hop over it and made a ton of noise. We were laughing and giggling the whole time, unsuspecting of what was to come. We looked around the small play place and park with flashlights we had on our person. Even with our somewhat powerful flashlights, our visibility was rather limited. We decided to enter the decaying building. Glass and dirt crunched under our feet as we stepped into the daycare section of the complex. There were still old Legos, wood chips from previous furniture, old torn dolls, and toys strewn about. The farther we walked around the daycare section, we naturally became more and more silent, until all we could hear was the crunch of the dirt under our feet. I found some crayons in a plastic container in the corner of the room. I walked over to pick them up, when all of a sudden, we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door leading to the psych ward part of the building. My friends and I all looked at each other. As a whole, we were a group of 5. Most of them were very bold and cocky. We all looked at each other when my friend Brian suggested we go and look to see where the sound came from. Personally, I was not too fond of the idea, but with my group of friends, there was no way anyone was going to decline such a thing. We all stacked up on the door and opened it. It was rusted to the floor, and we heaved it to get it open. As we walked in, the metallic smells and must became stronger, with a hint of something else which I couldn't put my finger on at that moment. We walked in, our flashlights pointed in every direction with Brian leading the group. The hallways were tight, and to the left and right were the occasional metal doorway, some with the doors still open. I felt slightly claustrophobic, and it felt a little hard to breathe. As we continued, Brian shone his flashlight into a room and recoiled. We all stopped walking as Brian slowly entered the room. "What is it?" I asked him. "I thought I saw someone here. It seems all fine now." To be honest, I thought he was just messing with us to increase our anxiety. But looking back, I think he was completely honest. He backed out of the room, and we continued walking deeper into the psych ward when another friend swiftly told us to stop. We came to a halt and all listened. In the distance ahead of us, we heard the subtle pitter-patter of footsteps echo through the hallway. We all looked at each other, fear in each of our eyes. Brian continued walking towards the sound. We considered turning back for a second without Brian, wondering if some ghost or something was in the building. But we couldn't do that to him. The closer we got, the more I felt like I was being watched, when finally we entered a room on the right which had the smell of rotting meat. In front of us was a dead deer. Its innards were spilled all over the floor, staining the concrete. A friend of mine had a very weak stomach and vomited all over the floor. That's when we heard whispering from somewhere. Brian shone his flashlight to the corner of the room, where a man with short hair was standing with his head down. He wore a bright green t-shirt stained with what I assumed to be blood, and torn beige pants. He did not have on any socks, and his feet seemed damaged. He was twitching sporadically and continued to mumble even after we saw him. We stared at him for a solid 30 seconds before he made his first true movement. He looked up at us with a haunting grin that sent shivers down our spine. "You guys here for the feast?" he said, each word with varying inflection and energy. This kicked us over the edge, and we bolted out of that room all the way back to the daycare center. The door was still open, and we decided to try and slam it shut, but the rust and pure weight of the door almost kept it open. It took 3 of us pulling with all of our strength to close it. And just before we did, I could still see the silhouette of the man watching us, his white teeth being the only other human feature I could see, as we sat behind the metal door catching our breath for a second, all looking at each other for confirmation that we all saw the same thing. After a little bit of labored breathing from each of us, we heard a light tapping on the door. That's when we decided that it was time to leave. We booked it out of the vicinity completely and ran home. A year after we visited that spot, police went back to do a routine search of the area and found the man. It was stated that the guy used to go to the psych ward before it closed down. He escaped the facility he was transported to and lived off the wildlife around the complex. When the cops brought him in, he had a series of diseases and sickness from eating raw meat. His mental condition was much worse than before. There were future rumors that he did kill someone in the forest while searching for food, but nothing has been confirmed. In the end, guys, be careful, especially in dangerous areas such as abandoned buildings. And to the creepy dude, I hope you get some help and we never see you again. I've been having a super lousy few months, and this is the kind of shit cherry on top. I was walking back from work yesterday to meet my spouse at home, where we have an apartment. It's getting darker earlier again, so it was close to full dark I was walking through. I'm always on edge when I walk alone, so I had my key lanyard in my hand already. I noticed right away when a man came out from a side street and crossed the road to walk on my side. I was already at a brisk pace and was just a block and a half from home. As I passed under a streetlight, he called out to me. I ignored him. He called again. I ignored. He shouted, "What's your problem?" Without turning around or slowing, I just shouted, "Not interested," over my shoulder and started walking even faster. He then proceeded to yell, "Don't be such a bitch," and sounded angry, which is the point where I thought, F this. I'm not dealing with this. So, I broke out into a sprint down the street toward my building. He shouted after me, and after a second, I heard his feet pounding the sidewalk. I made it to the front door of my building, yanked the door open, slapped it shut, jammed my key into the locked lobby entrance, yanked it open, sped through, and slammed it shut. The front lobby walls are made of glass, and you can see clearly inside. I figured the locking door would deter him, but speed walked through the lobby into the stairs anyway. A few male neighbors I'm acquainted and friendly with were sitting in the lobby chatting, and I waved when they said hi to me. Guess I'm lucky they were there, because the locked door did not deter him. I hear a massive shattering smash, nearly crapped my heart out, and my neighbor started yelling. I whipped around to see that this butthole had either kicked or punched the locking door, shattering most of it, and is now trying to reach through and let himself in. I shouted to the neighbors, "He followed me here. I don't know him," and then booked it up the stairs and ran all the way to my apartment. I could still hear shouting when I got into my place and told my spouse right away what happened. We called 911. Cops came to our building, and one spoke briefly to me and my spouse. A search was conducted for the guy, who apparently ran away when he saw the several angry yelling neighbors approaching him. We got a follow-up visit a couple hours later from a different cop. Turns out, the guy cut himself on the door, so it was easy to grab him once they found him. Apparently, this isn't his first time hanging around my complex, and he is known to the cops here as an addict who follows people around asking for money. He has been suspected of buying from dealers in our complex, but never caught. I guess I shouldn't even be surprised. It's not a good place, not a good building, just something we can afford until we can move on to something better. But, for freak's sake, I am so tired of living this way. To the addict who chased me home, let's not ever meet again. This is something that happened to me a couple years back that still freaks me out when I think about it. To start with this, it was around midnight and I was in my room, browsing stuff on my phone, when I suddenly hear what sounds like knocking outside my bedroom window. I'm on the ground level, by the way. I first shrugged it off as being a squirrel or something, until I heard the same sounds again, which is when I started becoming concerned. It was at this point that I left my room and called my dad to tell him what was happening. He tried to assure me it was nothing, and while this was happening, I heard even more knocking coming from around the front door. I tried calling out to see if it was my brother or anything, but didn't get any answers. At this point, I was starting to really freak out. It was after this that I heard someone at my back door trying to force the door open. It was locked, thankfully. And finally, after this, my dog finally caught on and started barking like crazy at the other end of the door, which finally drove whoever was out there off. After that happened, I called my grandpa, who lived a block over, to come and pick me up because I was way too scared to be able to stay the night in that house. In retrospect, I should have called the police, but I wasn't thinking straight and was shivering on the couch holding a kitchen knife the whole time I was waiting. I still have no idea who was out there that night. I had taken a walk alone in a nature trail earlier that day, and my only working theory is that someone had followed me home. I later learned that there were drifters living in the woods around that area, which adds to that. I have no evidence of that though. This was probably the scariest experience I've been through, and it still makes it hard for me to stay home alone at night. My story takes place 2 years ago, between the two first containment in France. I was home alone in my small apartment, working on something for my internship that I was freaking stressed about. It was the beginning of the afternoon, 2 p.m. I think. Someone knocked on my door, but I wasn't expecting anyone. I went to open up, and it was a guy I knew. Let's call him Jim. Jim and I had slept together a few times a few weeks before, until he pushed me away without explanation. We were still friends, but I was a little hurt. Was I that bad? Had he gotten what he wanted and wasn't interested anymore? I didn't dare ask the question because I was getting a little attached, and I preferred to wait for it to pass, especially since we were bound to run into each other again. Indeed, Jim had recently got a room in the flat of a friend of mine. The situation was quite funny because he had stumbled upon the ad without knowing that I knew the other tenants, and my friend didn't know yet that I knew the new roommate. I was going to tell her about it in person when we met again in college for our midterms. So, I knew I was going to see Jim again, but I didn't expect to run into him so soon after he moved in. let alone during a surprise visit from him to my apartment. I asked him what he was doing there. He said he was bored at the dorm and was just passing through. I invited him in. I was a bit uncomfortable because I still liked him. We had left without any explanation about his rejection before he moved in with my friend. We talked for a while about trivial things, but strangely enough, I still remember the main point. Then, he wanted to show me a new kind of massage against my stress that he had seen on TikTok. I hesitated a bit as I was still uncomfortable. "Do you trust me?" he asked. Yes. I sat on the floor and he touched my back for a while. Then, he touched my back again once I was lying down. I don't remember everything except that at one point his arm was around my neck, and I thought, I'm not sure I can breathe. And then, blackout. Of course, the memory of choking didn't come back right away. It took several months, but I'm trying to tell you the story in chronological order. When I came to, it was dark. I was still on the ground, bleeding. I don't remember if I noticed the injury right away, but I had a large hole in my right side, with many cuts underneath. The events are pretty fuzzy in my memory, but I wondered where Jim had gone and why I was alone. I went to look in the hallway, but my keys, which are normally always in the lock, were missing. I found the spare and looked outside. No one was there. Then I had my first stupid reflex. I thought, I'm hurt, I need to disinfect, and started to take a shower. I think I fell asleep and had nightmares of being tortured and kidnapped in the shower, probably a way for my brain to try to warn me that something bad was happening. I then looked for my phone, which was also missing from the apartment. I was confused, probably drugged, I realized later. I decided to go to bed to resume the search after resting. I told myself, if I'm still hurt when I wake up, it must be real. It seemed very logical in my mind at that moment. When I woke up, my mind was already a little clearer, but I was still not totally myself. It was 10 to 11 p.m., I think. I was still bleeding. I looked for my phone again, and I started to panic as I couldn't find it. I tried to calm down. I told myself that it was probably there somewhere. I just had to ask someone to call me. I contacted my best friend, let's call him Tom, via Messenger through my computer. I still had a hard time unlocking my computer. I couldn't type my code. I think I was still drugged. Luckily, Tom was online. He tried to call me on my phone, but no ringing could be heard in the apartment. I think he figured out that I wasn't in my right mind because he called me on Messenger to see if I was okay. It was he who gave me the details of our conversation. I have almost no memory of it. I said, if you think you've been hurt, do you call the fire department or the police first? He freaked out and asked me to explain what was going on. I was very confused, but I think he got the gist of it. He asked, did Jim do this to you? I don't know, maybe? I was still in denial at that point. Tom called the police on me. He couldn't come to help me himself because he was studying in another city. As I waited for the cops to arrive, I began to realize that I had completely messed up the crime scene by touching everything looking for my phone. Not to mention the shower and the nap, which could have killed me in retrospect. I was still in no pain though. The hole in my side started to hurt when I was taken care of by the paramedics that the cops called when they saw the extent of my injuries. I had to undergo surgery as a result of this assault, which took me months to accept as an attempted murder with a knife. I had a hole in my liver, a pneumothorax, and was bleeding a lot. Luckily, my other organs were not affected. While I was in the hospital, the cops came to take my statement and took Jim into custody. Imagine the surprise of my friend and her roommates when they found out that the new roommate not only knew me, but was also accused of assaulting and robbing me. 1 week after the assault, when I got out of the hospital, the first bad news was that the cops had not been able to retrieve the recordings from the surveillance cameras in my building, which had already been erased because the procedures had been too long. The next day, the policewoman in charge of the investigation told me that, of course, Jim denied having been at my place that day, and nobody was at the flat to confirm if he was indeed at home all day. That's it for now. Go home to your parents and get some therapy. Great. Shout out to my psychologist, who is an incredible person and helped me a lot. And then I waited for a long time. I had to have the seals for my building analyzed for Jim's DNA. Without video or witnesses, it was the only way to prove that he was my attacker, or at least that he was in my apartment that day. It took 1.5 years to get the prosecutor's verdict. No further action. No identifiable DNA other than mine had been found at the crime scene. I probably destroyed everything with a shower. So there you have it. We can't pursue the investigation. I could never prove it was Jim. I don't have any memory of the assault itself. I don't think I'll ever find them. But I have no doubt that Jim did this to me. I think if I ran into him, I would freeze like a rabbit in front of a car. Today, I am much better, but I still suffer from PTSD. For a while, I couldn't drink alcohol because the drunken feeling reminded me of when I was going to be unconscious. Now I only panic when I'm with someone and having trouble breathing. I can't pull the blanket over my face if I'm in bed with my boyfriend, for example. And most of all, it makes me sick to know that Jim is free to live his life and to hurt someone else. So, to Jim, I hope we never meet again. This happened probably 5 or 6 years ago. I think I was 18 at the time. For starters, I lived in a city where neighborhoods and forests kind of blend together. There are plenty of wooded areas where people go to have bonfires and parties. One night, after discovering that all of our usual spots were crowded with people, I suggested we go to a spot that I had been to a few times nearby. I had been there multiple times, but only during the day. The street where we park is maybe 200 feet from the tree line. It's your average middle-class neighborhood. Nothing crazy is really known to happen there. So, we walk in, start a bonfire, and we're all having a good time. Some of us are drinking and smoking a bit, myself included. After 45 minutes pass, and I'm a little intoxicated, but nothing major, and over the sound of our quiet music and my friends talking, I hear something odd. I can't make out what it is, so I figure maybe I'm just hearing things. Maybe another 10 minutes go by and I hear it again, a little better this time. It still sounds relatively far away, but it sounds like Velcro tearing. I stop and just kind of sit there trying to listen while my friends carry on laughing and talking. They haven't seemed to notice, and that's when I heard a sound I was very familiar with. A zapping noise, like you hear from a taser. Very brief, but unmistakable. My stomach drops, and I started looking around a little frantically. My girlfriend at the time was the first to notice my distress. She asks me what's wrong, and I explained, and she immediately starts worrying. She gets my friends to quiet down, and we all just sit there and listen for it. Then we hear it. An electric zap. Brief again, but we all know that sound. We all start panicking a bit, and we quickly put out the fire while asking each other what the F that was, or where exactly it was coming from. We're all scared to walk out. It's only maybe a 5-minute walk to the street, but it's dark. We all muster the courage to finally walk the path out, and we don't run into anyone. We finally get to the street and start walking to our cars, nervously laughing and relishing being under street lamps again. I see him first. He's walking towards us, not at us, just walking in the direction we just came from, slightly to the right of us. He's holding a stick of some sort. It scared me at first, but for a brief second, I calmed myself. It was a pretty safe neighborhood that I knew really well, and it was really common to see people out walking at night. But then I notice he's looking right at us. That stare is burned into my mind. We pass each other. My friends and I are all silent as we're having this stare down with this random man. And that's when it happened. He doesn't break eye contact, holds up the pole, and smiles this creepy effing smile. His eyes are open so wide. The end of the stick lights up bright, and that same zapping sound happens again, much louder this time. He's holding an effing cattle prod. We live in a city, no farmland nearby. What's the reason to have a cattle prod? My friends and I are silently crapping ourselves as he walks past us, maybe 20 feet away, and goes straight into the woods without a flashlight or anything. We all got into our cars and peeled out of there. We never went back to that spot. To that old creepy man, I hope we never meet you again. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I am a United States Air Force Security Forces airman, military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick, another military cop, and I decided to go explore some back roads and get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used, and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days off starting on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on and began to drive into the mountains. After driving around for an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted a bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees. as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small one-man tent was set back in the trees about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread and felt certain that there was someone in the tent. And if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in this area. No people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remotely would be, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving the strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in the tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built. No wood collected. The tent. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. As I left, I heard Nick start yelling, "Let's go. Let's get the F out of here." Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men. A third person was laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way he had come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still do not know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police, and they promised to send a trooper out to check out the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing were all gone, though he could tell people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I have not returned to the area and do not ever intend to. In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and were still stuck living together after the breakup, as she didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping and fishing, I jumped at the chance to take the trip with him. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful. Loads of lush forests, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a really good night. We turned in just after midnight. We shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably around 1:30. We must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched, yipping-type noise. I was kind of groggy, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant, and it sounded like a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment listening, and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these type of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise woke him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he would shine the flashlight on it and holler at it, hopefully scaring him off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His leg suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled, "It's not a coyote. It's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scary easily. I won't even watch horror movies. But I've never seen someone look that scared, and I never want to see that expression on someone's face again. So, I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and, in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote. But I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyways, he kept telling me just to look out the tent flap to make sure he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like crap, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust. And that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful, though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. If the making high-pitched noises at a stranger's tent in the middle of the night didn't give it away. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to F off. My body started yelling, "Excuse me, can you F off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent. And that's when we heard footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time. We started yelling again. "Seriously, F off. We have cell phones in here. If you don't F off, we're going to call the cops." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. It sounded like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sign of sunlight. Then, we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and were both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely was not manly on either of our parts. I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much. We really haven't ever talked about it since that day. So, there you go. That's my weird story. I'll always wonder what the heck that guy was doing out there, or what was wrong with him. Sometimes, I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple of girls. I'm not saying he was some serial killer, but it seemed like he was testing who was in the tent. I guess I'll never know. And for that, I am forever grateful. To that weird man in the woods, I hope I never see you again. I grew up out in the wooded country of Illinois, on a short dead-end street, 10 plus miles from a town, and there were 7 houses in the area, spread out on 2.5-acre wooded lots, or larger each. There were no large wild animals. There aren't bears or similarly large animals in the region, and people don't meander there or show up lost. Actually, lost folks or large animals wandering around never happened in the 20 years I lived there, so please keep that in mind. When I was a young girl in my early teens, I had a good guy friend a few years older than me who lived next door. Terry. Terry was allowed to go out with his friends much later than I was, and he would sometimes tromp over to my yard after getting home late and throw rocks from the gravel area outside at my window to chat. My bed was right next to the window. I'd open the window and we'd whisper stories and generally talk for a bit. My second-story window faced our backyard, and his house was to the side. I could see his house from my window over the shrub trees and walking path to his driveway. I'd often know if he was out. The light was on over the side door entrance, or already home, light was off. One time during the summer, when my windows were open, I heard a car in his driveway dropping him off. I was probably 14 years old, and it was around midnight. I heard Terry get out of a car and was talking to his friends. Soon his friends pulled away. I softly called out, as loud as I could without waking my parents, asking Terry to stop by and chat. He didn't respond, as he probably didn't hear me. Then, I came up with a not-so-brilliant idea to sneak outside and scare him. I'd spent many years in the woods and learning how to blend in and be silent. As kids, we'd often sneak around and scare each other. So I silently sneaked down from the second floor and out my back garage door, which led to our backyard below my window, which led to Terry's house, off the side, through our gravel area, then through a well-worn path through the woods about 25 feet long. My parents had put in a gravel pit around the back of the house, probably because nothing much grew due to the shade of the oak trees. There were 14-inch oak rounds set out as an uneven stepping path in the gravel, and if you stepped off of the rounds, the crunch of the gravel and rocks would give you away. I picked my way expertly and silently across the log rounds facing Terry's house. My eyes got accustomed to the dark, and I didn't see him. Also at that time, I heard the door of his house close and the light going off, signaling he went in, likely to bed. I waited a bit as I thought I saw something move in the woods between our houses, but not on the path we'd always use. If you didn't use the path, there were wild rose and raspberry plants that had thorns and were painful to walk through, if you weren't careful. So, I thought it was odd that he'd be in the woods, but maybe he wanted to scare me like I was plotting to do to him. But I saw something human-sized and dark moving through the woods, slow and pausing every once in a while, like me. It was coming closer, and I definitely saw it, but it was strange in that it wasn't walking directly to my window to talk. Therefore, I hunched down and waited in silence, wondering if I could still startle him. I still thought it was Terry, and he saw me sneak out, and he was trying to scare me. I watched a dark outline of a human figure moving, and then I would lose sight of it in the foliage. It seemed to be stalking, slowly, and listening and checking every few feet while hiding. So I whispered after losing patience one last time for Terry, but he didn't answer. I got bored of hiding and crouching, so I quietly tiptoed back to my garage door and went back inside, silently locking up as I went. I snuck back upstairs to my room, above the area where I was just standing and crouching. My window was open, and I definitely heard someone or something walking around the yard. I whispered again for Terry out my window, but got no answer. Then I heard someone or something fall and grunt and moan pretty loudly in the window well right below my window. It wasn't enough to wake my parents, but definitely loud enough I didn't mistake it, and it sent a shock of fear through me. If you aren't familiar with a window well, it's a semicircle hole connected to the house dugout about 3 or 4 feet deep and reinforced with metal. It allows a basement window to be put in below ground level, and the hole lets some natural light in. There is no way Terry would have fallen in our window well. He had been playing hide and seek and many outdoor games for years since we were young around the whole neighborhood. We knew everyone's window wells and house footprints, plus path in the woods, like the back of our hands. The grunt sounded humanish and not like an animal. It also pulled itself out quietly without a lot of thrashing. That's when I realized this wasn't a fun game, and someone or something was out there, and it wasn't Terry. I tried to look outside my window as best I could, but there was a screen on my windows to keep the bugs out, so I couldn't lean my head out the window to see next to the wall of our house directly below me. I then heard the crunch of rocks, as whatever it was stepping in the noisy gravel. Again, Terry would know where the log rounds were. It would not step in the gravel. He knew my parents were pretty strict, and he was as good at being quiet as I was. Whatever it was stopped, and I held my breath. I pretty much sat there with my face pressed against the screen, 2 stories up, for probably a half hour. It seemed like an hour, but I'm not sure. I didn't have patience back then to wait that long. I never heard it or him or her leave, but I grew tired and eventually fell asleep on my bed that was next to the window. There are a few things I'm certain of. That wasn't Terry. I asked him later, and he said he went to bed that night when he got home. He also would have no reason to lie. I'm pretty sure it wasn't one of our neighbors, and I can't think of any reason a person would be out there. We had few neighbors, and only 2 other houses out of the 7 had kids. Again, these 7 houses were spread out on 2.5 acres per home. There weren't any big animals in the area. As wooded as the whole area was, we only had some deer, but they were hunted and didn't come close to the homes. Plus, our dog scared them away. So, to the stranger in the woods, I hope I never meet you again. This happened to my roommate and I 2 years ago, when we drove into the national forest just outside of the town we live in. We go to a small college in New England, about 3 hours from any major city. For context, this forest has quite a few urban legends surrounding it and the local community. Although they do go there often, have a lot of superstitions about how to be safe while there. I had just broken up with my partner, and my roommate could sense I was feeling down. Finals were just around the corner, so she decided to help me get my mind off things and suggested we go to a nice spot she had found last week and just chill and de-stress. We took a couple of beers with us and drove to this secluded spot in the forest. From the moment we left the main asphalt road in the forest, I saw a couple of things that unsettled me. You could see the abandoned houses of a ghost town from the higher ground the road was on, and we saw this old doll hanging from a rope on a tree. It was some creepy stuff, but we didn't really give it a second thought and kept driving. We got to a clearing and parked our car behind some trees, popped open the back of our SUV, and started just talking and playing music. About 10 minutes into this, 2 cars appeared from the road and parked in the clearing. My friend didn't pay them attention. Instead, she kept talking. But as I was facing them from where I sat, I couldn't stop seeing what they did. A guy popped out of each car, talked for a few minutes, and then I saw them take out a long object covered in a dark plastic bag from the back of one of the cars. This is when I noticed these guys had guns, and not like shotguns, which I see often in this town, but handguns. Then they started lighting the bag on fire. I told my friend to get down, and she turned around and saw them for the first time. Black smoke was rising from the bag, and between trying to keep my head down and still glances at them, I saw them take out a second object and heard them shoot at it right before they set it on fire. I don't know how long my friend and I were lying there in silence, but it was definitely enough to let the terror sink in and whisper to each other how much we loved each other in case this was what we thought it was. At some point, I looked up and saw that they were pointing at our car and saw them walking into the woods, maybe trying to follow our tracks or trying to look for us. All I know is that right then, I told my friend to jump into the driver's seat and make a run for it. I shut the back door, and between that and the car starting up, the guys heard it and started running towards us, then ran towards one of their cars and hopped in. We went over a hill, and driving away above what was safe for dirt roads on a hillside, we lost them. We drove to a neighboring town and roamed around for a while, just to make sure no one was following us before we went back to our dorm. That day, we tried to make fun of the whole situation and got really drunk before finally breaking down and crying from knowing we had seen something we were not supposed to. We were at first terrified of telling anyone, but eventually did tell officers on campus who contacted the police. But they never found anything. To the 2 strange guys out in the woods, I hope we never meet again. What I'm about to describe will sound like a cheap-ass cliche movie script, but this indeed happened. Even at home, barely anybody believes me without confirmation from the other parties involved. Buckle up, it's a long haul. Autumn 2019 in British Columbia, Canada. I am from Germany, but spent half a year in Canada as part of my bachelor's degree. I barely got back before COVID hit. I was 22 years old at the time, and the other people involved were about the same age. Another foreign student and I befriended this local Canadian student. We all had the same interests and humor, and the dude became a very good friend of ours. He told us all about the local area, and we spent a week in the summer with him and his father at their very remote, remember this, cabin near some woods. They taught us how to handle guns there and let us shoot a lot. Ammo is expensive AF. Then, fall came, and we had a lot of free time due to being finished with all our papers. So, our buddy proposed that we spent a few days at his dad's cabin, this time without his father. We went, hell yeah, because we could load up on booze and weed and have a great time there. You know, just living the life. 3 close dudes in the woods gaming and getting wasted. Sounds great, right? After loading up on all the supplies, the first 3 days were very calm. On the first day, just like the last time I was there, I barely slept and was generally tense. This is because I am a naturally very paranoid guy, and I often go into alert mode in situations, which is often mocked by my friends. In this case, what freaked me out the most was the fact that we were far away from civilization. And you never understand how quiet your surroundings can be until you spent some time in a remote area like this, which led me to often stand in the dark at night, listening to the surroundings of the cabin. But after the first few days, I got less paranoid. After all, I was with friends, was constantly high, and we were quite armed and dangerous. Probably most dangerous to ourselves, though. Day 4 came. We spent the day attempting to hunt in the woods, mostly just chilling under trees with a beer and rifle in hand. But in the evening, it started to rain heavily. After an hour, we were starting to see lightning in the distance, with quite a bit of time passing between lightning and thunder, which meant the thunderstorm itself was still some time away. So, we aborted our incompetent hunting attempts and started trekking back to the cabin. It took us about an hour to reach it, due to it already being very dark and the rain creating unsafe footing. For context, you should know that once you spent a few days in the wilderness and haven't seen a soul other than your friends for days, you can become quite careless about your surroundings. I think you can imagine why I am telling you that last part. So, we enter the cabin. At that time, the thunderstorm was raging full on. We put away our gear and changed clothes, except for our guns. Yeah, I know. Drugs and guns are a horrible combination, and I wouldn't mix that crap nowadays, but we were drilled quite well by Canadian friend's dad regarding trigger discipline, safety, etc. And man, I really miss spooning a rifle while sleeping. We cozied down in the living room at a table, started a YouTube video, and began playing cards. Barely 20 minutes passed since we returned, and at the time, we didn't bother closing the curtains in the living room, because thunderstorms are baller as F. So, imagine that we were 3 guys sitting around a table, occasionally in awe at the weather outside while playing cards. In such a remote place, it is extremely dark outside. Without a full moon and clear skies, it is pitch black. The only lamps we have are old-ass vintage-looking and dimmer than my phone screen. What comes next is how my also non-local friend has described what he saw. While sipping from his beer, another lightning struck outside. He spit it out instantly after the lightning came and screamed loudly and stood up. No words, just the sound of panic. My Canadian friend and I were instantly perplexed and looked at him. There is somebody outside, He started rambling about how in that split second, the lightning illuminated the outside of the cabin. He saw a person standing a bit of distance away from the cabin, looking directly at us. Now this is what I meant when I said cliche horror story, and barely anybody believes me at first, but this did happen. My non-local friend is obviously in full-on panic. His face looks anxious. This communicated to our Canadian buddy and me that this guy wasn't just messing with us. He did see somebody outside. I grabbed my rifle and pulled the bolt to rack around into the chamber. I feel that warm sensation running down my spine of my body, releasing adrenaline. I tried to stay far away from the window, stare into the darkness outside, but I can't see anything. While our Canadian friend rushed into his room to grab his pistol, I started panicking even more because I realized we didn't lock the door. Why would we? We haven't seen anyone in days and are in the middle of the wilderness. So I run to the door and lock it. Our friend returns with his pistol, which he grabbed because there was a flashlight attached to it. He carefully approached the window, then changed his pace from sneaky to fast and pushed the window open with one hand, while the other hand was aiming the handgun outside. I wish I was any good at drawing, because what we saw next when our friend turned on the flashlight was the most terrifying image I have ever seen. It is burned into my mind. The fact that I cannot share that image with other people has been bugging me for 3 years now. The light turns on. What we saw in that moment was a man, tall and slim, dressed in all black, with a hooded raincoat which he has pulled over his head, almost covering his eyes. But not far away from the cabin, just a few steps away from the window. Not standing as our friend yelled earlier, but crouching, looking directly at us with clenched eyes and a freaking terrifying little smirk on one side of his mouth. Another lightning flashed, and for that moment, we were all frozen. The image of what we saw must have shocked the other guys as much as it did me, because nobody said anything for a few seconds. There is a hard-to-explain dreadful feeling about seeing something like this. In a storm, in the middle of nowhere, a person dressed in a black raincoat is suddenly crouching so close to you and facing you. Our Canadian buddy was aiming his pistol, attached flashlight, at the also frozen, crouched smirking man, and just yelled out with a slight stutter and a higher-pitched voice than I've ever heard from him. Get the F away from us, or we will shoot. I guess at that moment, after his eyes adjusted, the raincoat man realized that this was not just a flashlight, but a gun, and I was standing next to my friend with a hunting rifle on my arm. Raincoat man's slight smirk changed to something where I am unsure if it was shock or rage. All this was happening in less than a minute. While my friend kept on yelling and I was just frozen, the raincoat figure turned by about 90 degrees towards the nearest tree line and went from crouch to full sprint quickly. He ran away to the right side of our window. 2 of us poked their head out of the window to see where exactly he was going. But with the heavy rainfall and darkness, we could barely make out anything in the distance of that tree line. After a few minutes of just looking at each other in disbelief, we decided to pop off a few rounds outside the window to prove that we were for real and to cope. When the shock wore off, we decided to call the police. They asked a lot of questions on the phone to describe the location of the cabin and a description of the man who just almost crept up on us, totally unsuspecting and only revealed due to lightning and luck. Due to us being in such a remote area, the cops told us it'd take at least 1 or 2 hours for somebody to come out. They asked because of the weather and time if it'd be all right if they send somebody out tomorrow, to talk to us about all the details. Given how the man saw that we were armed, he probably wouldn't come back again. We agreed. We discussed just jumping in the truck and leaving right now, but us dumbasses were too lazy to refuel the truck. The idea of doing this now, in the dark and in that heavy rain, was just too frightening. I kept thinking about this guy lurking in the darkness and picking us off one by one. We spent the night sleeping in shifts. One person was awake and standing guard. The others at least attempted to sleep. When my turn came, the rain had died down. I turned off all the lights, opened a window, and just sat there in the darkness, trying to listen for any sound I could hear and looking out of the windows to scan the area. Let me tell you, when you're sitting in the dark for hours in full alert mode, just trying to sit still and listen and look around, you have a lot of time to think and reiterate what just happened. Close to the middle of the next day, 2 cops arrived. We had to give them a detailed report of what happened, when it happened, and had to show them in which direction the raincoat shade ran off to. They said they will organize for a patrol to comb through the woods, but that might take a while because they need experienced outdoorsmen, etc. Sadly, we didn't see many details of the man's face. We couldn't tell if he was young or old, only that he was tall and clean-shaven. The chances of finding who exactly that was and find out what the hell he was attempting to do were very small. Though one of the officers expressed that this whole happening was deeply worrying. We left the cabin a few hours after the police left, and Canadian Guy's dad insisted we stay at his place at least for a day until we felt safe again. He also wanted to hear every last detail and figured that the time has come to install cameras around the cabin. I don't remember this part for sure, but I believe that I heard later the dad and his brother went back to the cabin and just sat there in the dark, waiting for the raincoat man to return. But I never heard of any results, so I guess he must have gone hunting in other areas. I never heard from them cops again. Next January, I left Canada and returned home. My Canadian friend was called in for an interview a few months later, and it seemed like the police were still seriously investigating this, looking for the guy who crept up on a cabin during a thunderstorm. The image of that crouched raincoat figure, completely wet and surrounded by darkness, so close to our cabin, is burned into my mind. I will most likely never forget this. I still sometimes turn off all the lights and just look out the windows in silence, trying to listen for sounds, even though I am on the other side of the world now. We have speculated a lot about what that was. The winning theory is that this guy most certainly had sinister intentions. This did not look like just an attempt at burglary. Remember, we had dim lights on. You could see that there was somebody inside the cabin. This guy was creeping towards us in a raincoat during a thunderstorm. When my friend yelled out that he saw somebody, this guy went from walking and standing to crouching, and he went closer towards the window. I suspect the raincoat man wanted to check what kind of victim was on the menu. And I don't really want to imagine what he had in store if there were 2 unarmed girls there, in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. We didn't see any headlights passing the clearing the cabin was on. The guy also had no backpack or something, just the raincoat and black weather-appropriate clothing. I'd bet my soul that this guy was a man on a mission who knew exactly what he was doing and what he was well prepared for. While writing this story, I also started thinking about the logistics of it all. The man must have a camp or at least a car hidden somewhere in those woods. You can't sustain yourself out there otherwise. I also got the feeling that he either came upon the cabin during the storm itself, or that he spotted us in the woods during the hunting we did before. We moved slowly, while also not being shy with waving our lights around, and in total pitch darkness wilderness, a proper flashlight must have been as easy to spot as the beacons of Gondor, so he might have tracked us through the woods until we reached the cabin. If anybody has heard about similar things happening in the area of British Columbia near Vancouver, please let me know. That mystery has a grip on me for the rest of my life. Sometimes, I still dream of this raincoat figure creeping closer towards me with each flash of lightning. To that weird guy out in the woods in that black trench coat, I hope I never see you again. And that, dear readers, is the end of these true Let's Not Meet stories. I hope that you are all resting well and enjoying Slumberland. Until next time, I'll read to you soon. Good night.